Hello there. Welcome to my channel. You know, lately I've been getting a number of questions from viewers regarding my thoughts around security. So I thought I would put together a video that would talk about that as it relates to these Eink devices. And in particular, I think these questions are coming up because of the Viwood's AI paper products, which is a new product on the market that focuses e-note-taking along with AI tools, and by AI tools specifically, the integration of large language models, in that case, ChatGPT-3. But what I want to focus on here is I do want to focus on my broad approach to security and these devices. I will touch specifically on the question of AI as well, but I think that my framework and how I look at security is much bigger than that, and I'm sharing it hopefully to be helpful to you. But having said that, I should be very clear from the outset that I am not a security expert. This is not my technical or professional expertise. I am an educated consumer. I have done quite a bit of thinking on the topic, but really just think of it from the perspective of one person's opinion as an educated consumer, not so much as an expert. And if you're looking for more of an expert view on security, especially a more nuanced and detailed view, you're probably going to want to look at other videos, but this will be a nice, good overview and introduction. And at a minimum, you'll know exactly where I stand on security and what I do personally in response to those concerns. So that's the hope of this video. I think the very first place where anyone would want to start is understanding on a particular device, and again, we're going to focus on Eink note-taking devices. Where is the secure information? What are the things that, if it were to leak out and get into the wrong hands, would be considered sensitive information and would be problematic that you lost control of that information? I think it's kind of important just to take a few minutes to think about your device and to think about where those vulnerabilities lie, because that'll help you think through what your risk tolerance is. So what are some things that might come to mind? Well, if you're using an e-ink device that has a lot of apps, are you using banking apps on that device? You know, that might be something to consider. Are you loading documents onto your device? Are any of those documents confidential? You know, are they in the public sphere? You know, what's the sensitivity there? But in my particular case, both at work and at home, my most sensitive information is in the notes themselves. So for me, as I think about security on these devices, I'm thinking about my notes and what the potential risk is if those notes were to be given into the wrong hands. So that's the first part, is understanding what your risk is and where it lies. All right, so let's kind of go through a thought exercise, which I think is kind of helpful. And in this exercise, we're going to create 3 fictional companies. One's going to be headquartered in Belgium, one's going to be headquartered in the United States, and one's going to be headquartered in China. Now, I want to be clear, this is just a fictional thought exercise. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular as I go through this exercise. We're just going to kind of do a basic risk assessment based on the environments that each of these 3 companies operate in. So we'll start with Belgium. Now, right off the bat, there's a major advantage to anyone working with the products of this country and this company because of the regulations of the European Union. The European Union, or EU, has one of the best consumer protection frameworks in the world. So you've got a really good legal system in which this company is operating in. So that's great. Belgium itself is a strong democracy, but also it has the advantage of being kind of a small country relative to its economic marketplace. So not only do you have this nice framework of consumer protections, but you have a company that is less likely to be a target for malicious activity simply because it's a smaller target. So those are the positives. Now, just because of those positives doesn't mean that there is no risk, because after all, even good companies might have flaws in the design of their security as it relates to their servers. they can still be a target. Their size helps, but isn't a guarantee that they wouldn't be a target. And of course, that would depend to some degree on the success of their product as well. So the risk isn't zero, but there's a lot of positives there. The negatives exist, but are not as huge. So we're going to give this country and this company a risk score of 1, just to give it an arbitrary number. Now let's go ahead then and move over to the United States. So the United States also has really good consumer protections, maybe not as good as the EU, and it does vary from state to state, but they are there. So that's a positive. In addition to that, of course, you're operating in a strong, generally strong legal framework in the United States. But on the other hand, there are some negatives there as well. It's a very large marketplace, a very large target on the back. Any company in America that's successful is going to draw attention to a lot of bad actors. And so that's a concern. The country, the United States in particular, has a very strong apparatus around gathering information and what have you. For example, the National Security Administration. So there are some chances that your information could be given to the government. There are some protections in place there, but those protections aren't as good as you would expect in a country like Belgium that doesn't have as nearly as large of that kind of apparatus in place. So there is some risk that the government could get a hold of your notes, although that risk, I would still argue, is quite small. Let's go ahead and give the United States then a risk score of 3. 3 times the risk of the Belgian company, but there are a lot of positives that are in play. Now let's go ahead and then move to the China example. So this company really doesn't have the advantage of a legal framework of any consumer protections for people who are not Chinese citizens. So if you're, like an American, for example, you have either no laws to protect you, and certainly the court system is not going to enforce any rights on your behalf. So there's no framework there to rely upon. In addition, there is, much like the US, a country that could be very much interested in your information if they wanted to, and there's very little barriers, unlike the US, to be able to gather that information. If the government of China wanted to take control of a server of a company that operates in China, there's very little that would prevent that from occurring. So a lot of risk there. So you'd think there would be a really large risk score as it relates to Chinese companies. But there are mitigating factors that actually do work in the consumer's behavior. A Chinese company knows, and this is true of other companies as well, but if there were to be a data breach, it would have devastating consequences to their organization. So there's a lot of motivation because of that to try to put the security measures in place, particularly to prevent losing data to, say, an attack by an outside entity, for example. So there is a lot of impetus there, even though they operate in an environment that is inherently more riskier than the 2 environments that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and give China, the Chinese company, a risk score of 9. So 9 times riskier than the Belgian company, 3 times riskier than the US. Now these numbers, of course, are arbitrary and almost assuredly are wrong, right? So again, because I'm not a security expert, I'm in no position to be able to calculate actual probabilities. I'm just trying to lay out a conceptual framework to operate in. So hopefully that makes sense. Also, having said all that, I also want to be very clear that I am not actually aware within the Eink note-taking space, within these companies that operate in that space, of any actual data breaches of information from their servers. So there might be an incident, and if there is, please put that in the comments below, but I'm not aware of one. So everything I'm talking about is conceptual risk. I want to be very clear. Not actual risk based on events that have occurred in the past. Okay, having said that, Let's then go ahead and using this framework, I'm going to apply my own personal situations that determines my tolerance for risk given this framework. So I basically have two different scenarios. I have an at work scenario and an at home scenario. Now the work scenario, I work in the healthcare industry. I take a lot of notes every day. I take meeting notes. Sometimes I'm researching topics. I'm writing those down. Most of my notes actually aren't particularly confidential, but sometimes they are, and sometimes they do contain sensitive information. Because of that, my risk tolerance is 0, meaning that it's not possible for me to use any of the devices from the fictional companies that we've talked about, including Belgium, because I can't take any type of risk with my notes. So there's no possibility that I could use cloud services, for example, to back up those notes, or use any type of interaction with online services that might put my notes at risk. What that means from a practical perspective is I have a SuperNote A5X, which is my main device I use at work. I have never logged in to a SuperNote account on that device. I do have a SuperNote account, but that's been used exclusively at home on a different device, not on the device at work. In addition to that, I'm hardly ever on Wi-Fi. The only times I activate Wi-Fi is if I'm manually moving files to my computer, or I'm downloading a firmware update. That's the extent of it. So I'm very risk intolerant, and it doesn't matter what your risk score is. Anything above 0 is unacceptable to me. However, it's the polar opposite at home. In my home environment, I don't have any particular sensitive information. I'm mostly taking notes, like lists of things I'm going to do maybe that weekend. Maybe I'm jotting notes down for video ideas. Maybe I'm just doing some creative thinking or what have you. There's nothing particularly sensitive. There's no passwords in any of my notes. So there, I'm on the other extreme. My risk tolerance is fine. Any of those 3 scenarios that we talked about is perfectly acceptable to me, and I would love to use their online servers for the convenience and what have you. So for me, in that scenario, I am completely risk tolerant, and in my work scenario, not at all. So those are 2 extremes, obviously, but you could find yourself in the middle. That's not the case with me, but it is reasonable that in some cases maybe you have home notes that are generally fine, but there is a little bit of secure information. Maybe you do store passwords on your device, and you might feel that maybe that in the Chinese company's example, or maybe even in the US example, that's too risky. So for you, you would find yourself at a risk tolerance of being okay with the Belgian company's products, but not so much the other countries. That's certainly possible. It's just in my case, I find myself on the 2 extremes. Okay, so let's kind of round things up by talking now specifically about AI. And in particular, if you ask me the question of whether I'm concerned about AI, the answer is yes, but probably not for the reasons that you're thinking. I don't think that my queries to AI, nor the results that come back, are particularly sensitive. After all, what's coming back is only public information, and my queries are generally pretty vague. There's no sensitive information in those either. So I don't have any particular concerns about using AI tools like large language models. I don't feel that that creates any additional risk for me than the content of my notes. I wouldn't use an AI tools in the work environment for the reasons we talked about, because I can take 0 risk there. But at home, I'm perfectly comfortable with doing that. But the place where I'm really concerned about AI is actually not from the user experience perspective, but certainly more so on the back-end perspective. One of the advantages of security, certainly not an advantage you want to rely on solely, but certainly an advantage, is being a small target, not being something or someone that attracts the interests of a bad actor to take your information is a really powerful security attribute to have, which is great. But the problem with AI, in my mind, is that the cost from a bad actor to be able to sift through tons of data is getting smaller and smaller. So think of it this way. If we go, 20 or 30 years ago, and maybe you're a foreign security agency and you're trying to, steal information from other countries and other people, you have to be selective about your human capital and what resources that you put into trying to gather that information. You're going to be selective at the onset. You're even going to be more selective as you pursue certain leads. But with AI, the potential is, and we may not be there yet, but we're going to get there fairly quickly, to where all you need is the ability to just get the information and let AI do the heavy lifting at a fairly low cost, relatively speaking. And then whatever comes out of AI, then you use your human capital to follow up on that and to try to take advantage of that information. In other words, the cost of data mining drops so significantly with AI. Yes, you do have to create large data centers in order to support that, but that's a cost that these countries all over the world are going to be willing to do, including bad actors that are not associated with the country. They're going to be willing to have data centers to be able to have this functionality and to be able to data mine and then utilize their human capital efficiently, even though they've cast a much broader net. So that's where I worry in particular about AI. I think the risks of your information being online are now greater simply because being a small target won't really have any tangible meaning anymore because of the cost of mining that data will have gone down significantly. So that's where I worry about AI. But in terms of a tool of using the information, I'm no worried about AI than I'm worried about loading notes onto a server. And we've gone through the details of how I am or am not concerned about that in my two examples. Anyway, I hope all of this was helpful. Again, this is just one person's perspective. I'm not an expert, and if you have any comments or things in my thinking that you think maybe should be reconsidered, please put those in the comments so that I and others can see and learn from that. But anyway, you understand at the minimum my perspective on security and how I think about it. And hopefully, best case scenario, might have been helpful for you as well. All right, I'll look forward to those comments, and until next time, I will see you then.